What kind of man eats his supper on top of the corpses of his enemies? The year is 1066. On a blood-soaked hill in southern England, a man sits down to dinner. Around him lie the bodies of thousands. The grass is slick with blood. The air smells of iron and death. He does not pray. He does not weep. He orders his servants to bring him bread and wine. He eats among the dead because he wants them to know, even in death, that he is the master of this slaughter. His name is William. They call him the Bastard. By the time the sun sets on this day, they will call him the Conqueror. Stories like this should not be forgotten. Subscribe if you agree. But to understand how a tanner's grandson became the most feared man in Europe, you have to go back to the beginning, to a childhood soaked in blood, to a boy who learned one lesson above all others. Power is the only shield. Without it, you are meat for the wolves. And William was born surrounded by wolves. The year is 1028. In the small Norman town of Falaise, a boy is born to scandal. His father is Robert, Duke of Normandy. His mother is Herleva, the daughter of a tanner, a woman who works with leather, who smells of ammonia and animal skins. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval Europe, this is a disaster. William is not just illegitimate, he is the product of a union so far beneath his father's station that it is almost unthinkable. The Norman nobles call him William the Bastard. It is not a nickname, it is a brand. For the first 7 years of his life, William lives in his father's shadow. But in 1035, the safety net vanishes. Duke Robert decides to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Before he leaves, he forces his barons to swear loyalty to his young son. Robert never returns. He dies on the road home. 7-year-old William is now the Duke of Normandy. He is also completely defenseless. The Norman barons do not see a child. They see an opportunity. The hunting season begins. William's guardians start dying. One by one, the men assigned to protect him are murdered. Osborne, his steward, is butchered in William's own bedroom. According to later chroniclers, Osborne heard the creak of floorboards in the night. Assassins had broken into the castle. Osborne threw himself onto the sleeping boy just as the blades came down. They slashed Osborne's throat. William woke up screaming, drenched in the warm blood of the only man left who loved him. He survived by running. For years, the young duke was moved from hiding place to hiding place. He slept in peasant hovels. He was smuggled out of castles in the dead of night. His own relatives tried to kill him. The boy who should have ruled Normandy was a fugitive in his own land. But William did not break. He hardened, he watched, he learned. By the time he was 15, the frightened boy was gone. In his place stood a warrior. In 1047, William crushed a major rebellion at the Battle of Valais Dunes. He fought on the front lines. He was 19 years old. He had been fighting for his life since he was 7, and now, for the first time, he had the power to make others fear him. He used it. When the town of Alençon rebelled against him, the defenders made a fatal mistake. They hung animal hides over their walls and screamed insults. "Work for the tanner," they shouted. "Hides for the tanner's grandson." They were mocking his mother's low birth. William stormed the town. He captured 32 of the mockers. He dragged them into the mud before the walls. And then, in front of the entire garrison, he ordered his men to chop off their hands and feet. He left them writhing in the dirt. The message was simple: insult the bastard, and you will lose the limbs you used to do it. The rebellion stopped. The mockery stopped. William had conquered his own duchy, with severed hands and absolute ruthlessness. But Normandy was not enough. Across the English Channel lay a richer prize: a kingdom, a crown, and a chance to wash away the stain of his birth forever. The King of England was a man named Edward. They called him the Confessor. Edward was old and frail. He had no children, and the question of who would inherit his throne was tearing England apart. William claimed that Edward had promised him the crown. Whether this promise was real or invented, William believed it, and more importantly, he intended to collect. But there was a problem. Standing between William and the English throne was a man named Harold Godwinson. Harold was everything William was not. He was legitimate. He was loved by his people. He was the richest and most powerful earl in England. William needed to trap him. In 1064, fate dealt William a winning hand. Harold Godwinson was sailing when a storm drove his ship onto the shores of Ponthieu, a county neighboring Normandy. The local lord captured Harold and threw him in a dungeon. William heard the news and moved fast. He demanded that the prisoner be handed over. William paid the ransom. He gave Harold fine clothes, weapons, and horses. He welcomed him into the ducal court as an honored guest. But make no mistake, Harold was not a guest. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage. William needed Harold to acknowledge his claim to the English throne. He could not torture it out of him. He had to charm it out of him. He had to make Harold complicit in his own destruction. So William took Harold on campaign into Brittany. They rode side by side. They ate from the same table. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, they fought together as brothers in arms. William was playing a long game. He knighted Harold. In the feudal code, accepting arms from another man meant accepting him as your superior. Harold was desperate to return home. He played along. William anticipated this. He prepared the ultimate insurance policy. The climax came at a ceremony in Bayeux. William gathered his court. He placed a large table in the center of the hall, draped in a rich cloth of gold. On top sat 2 small reliquaries containing holy relics. He asked Harold to swear an oath to support William's claim to the English throne. Harold looked at the armed Norman knights surrounding the room. He looked at William's cold, expectant stare. He had no choice. If he refused, he would never leave Normandy alive. The moment the words left Harold's lips, William stepped forward and pulled away the gold cloth. Harold gasped. Underneath the cloth, the table was not a table at all. It was a massive chest, filled to the brim with holy relics, the bones of saints. By hiding the sheer volume of the relics, William had tricked Harold into swearing a catastrophic oath. In the 11th century, breaking a promise made on holy bones was not just a lie. It was a mortal sin. It damned your soul to hell, and more importantly, it gave your enemies the moral right to destroy you. Harold had been outmaneuvered. He had just handed William the one thing the bastard lacked: divine legitimacy. William smiled and let him go. He knew exactly what would happen. He knew Harold would break the oath the moment King Edward died. And when that happened, William would no longer be a foreign invader. He would be the righteous arm of God, coming to punish a perjurer. 2 years later, in January of 1066, the trap snapped shut. King Edward died. The English council immediately elected Harold Godwinson as king. Harold accepted the crown, ignoring the oath he had sworn in Normandy. Across the English Channel, William received the news while hunting. According to chroniclers, he did not rage. He did not scream. He simply returned to his castle, sat on a bench, and covered his face with his cloak. He stayed there in silence for hours. He was not grieving. He was calculating. The road to England was open. But that road crossed the sea, and no one had successfully invaded England from the continent in 600 years. William was proposing something that seemed impossible. His own barons thought he had lost his mind. When William called his council of war, the reaction was skepticism, bordering on horror. They told him the venture was impossible. The cost was too high. The risk was suicidal. William did not argue with logic. He argued with greed. He unrolled a map of England. He pointed to the rich farmlands, the prosperous towns, the silver mines. He promised them not just glory, but loot. If they invested their ships and soldiers now, they would become the new lords of England. The skepticism evaporated. Greed is a powerful motivator. Nobles from across Europe pledged men and ships. They were gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. The forests of Normandy began to disappear. The coast became a massive shipyard. William was not just moving an army, he was moving a city. To seal the deal, William sent an envoy to Rome. He argued that Harold was an oath-breaker and a perjurer. The Pope agreed. He sent William a papal banner and a ring containing a hair of St. Peter himself. The effect was electric. The invasion was no longer a raid for land. It was a holy crusade, blessed by Rome. Mercenaries from across Europe flocked to William's banner. By August, everything was ready. Hundreds of ships, packed with soldiers and horses, waiting to sail. William had done the impossible. He had assembled an invasion force capable of conquering a kingdom. Then the wind betrayed him. For 6 agonizing weeks, the wind blew from the north. It pinned the fleet to the coast. The waiting began to rot the army from the inside out. Food supplies were eaten before they left the dock. Disease began to spread. Mercenaries started to desert. William watched his dream disintegrating on the beach. He grew desperate. He moved the fleet up the coast, hoping to catch a different wind. But the wind refused to shift. He ordered the body of the local saint to be carried in a solemn procession around the camp. The entire army knelt in the sand, praying for a breeze. William, the man who trusted only steel, was begging the sky for a miracle. What William did not know was that the delay was the greatest stroke of luck in military history. While William cursed the north wind, that same wind was filling the sails of another fleet. 300 miles to the north, a nightmare was descending on England. 300 Viking longships, carrying perhaps 10,000 warriors. They were led by Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, the most feared warrior in Christendom. He stood nearly 7 feet tall. He was called the Thunderbolt of the North. And he was not alone. Standing beside him was Harold Godwinson's own brother. Tostig had been exiled and bitter. He had crossed the sea to find an ally who could help him destroy his brother. This was not just an invasion, it was a family feud written in blood. King Harold Godwinson was in London when the news arrived. The Vikings had landed in the north. They were camped near York, demanding hostages and tribute. Harold faced an impossible choice. If he stayed in the south, waiting for William, the Vikings would ravage the north. If he marched north to fight Hardrada, the south would be defenseless against the Normans. Harold chose to fight the enemy who was actually there. He rallied his elite soldiers and began one of the most remarkable forced marches in military history. His army covered 185 miles in just 4 days. They marched day and night. They moved so fast that the Vikings had no idea they were coming. On September 25, 1066, Harold sprung his trap. The Vikings were relaxing near Stamford Bridge. It was a warm day. Thinking the English were still hundreds of miles away, they had left their heavy chainmail on the ships. They were sunbathing when the horizon suddenly glittered with steel. Harold's army poured over the hills like a flood. The surprise was total. The battle was a massacre. Without their armor, the Vikings were cut down by the hundreds. Harold Hardrada went down with an arrow through the throat. Tostig was killed fighting beside his Norwegian ally. The Viking Age ended that afternoon in a muddy, blood-soaked field in Yorkshire. Harold Godwinson had done the impossible. He had annihilated the most feared warrior in the world. He was exhausted, he was wounded, but he was victorious. He sat down in York to host a victory feast. The wine flowed. The relief was palpable. Then the doors of the banquet hall burst open. A messenger stumbled in, covered in mud and sweat. He had ridden from the south coast without stopping. The room went silent. The wind had changed. William's fleet had sailed. The Normans had landed at Pevensey Bay. They were burning Sussex. Harold looked at his exhausted men. They had just fought the hardest battle of their lives. They were 200 miles from the new threat. The victory at Stamford Bridge turned to ash in his mouth. He stood up, pushed away his plate, and ordered his men to march again. History was not giving him a break. It was setting him up for the kill. On the morning of September 28, 1066, William landed at Pevensey. The shore was undefended. As William leaped from his flagship, his foot slipped on the wet pebbles. He crashed face first into the sand. A gasp went through the ranks. In the superstitious medieval mind, this was a catastrophic omen. His men froze. They murmured that God had abandoned them. William did not panic. He grabbed 2 fistfuls of wet sand, raised his hands high for all to see, and roared, "See, my lords, I have taken England with both my hands." With one sentence, he turned a clumsy fall into an act of possession. The panic evaporated. The landing continued. William established a base at Pevensey, but he had a problem. He was stranded on English soil with no supply lines. Winter was approaching. He needed Harold to come to him, and he needed Harold to come now, while the English were still exhausted. William knew exactly how to pull the strings. Sussex was the personal territory of the Godwinson family. William ordered a campaign of absolute terror. He unleashed his soldiers on the countryside. They burned villages to the ground. They slaughtered livestock. They murdered civilians. The smoke from the burning hamlets rose high into the autumn sky. It was a message written in fire. "Look what I am doing to your people, Harold. Come and stop me." In London, Harold was trying to rebuild his army. His best men were dead or wounded from Stamford Bridge. His brothers begged him to wait. Stay in London, they said. Burn the crops, starve William out, let winter kill the Normans. It was the smart choice, the cold, military choice. But Harold was not thinking like a general. He was feeling like a king who had failed his people. His pride could not tolerate the insult. He refused to sit behind walls while his homeland burned. Driven by rage and duty, Harold made the fatal mistake. He ordered the march. He did not wait for reinforcements. He did not wait for his men to rest. He pushed his battered army south. On the evening of October 13th, Harold's army emerged from the dense forest. They were exhausted, footsore, and fewer in number than they should have been. They made camp on a ridge near a gray apple tree, blocking the road to London. Just a few miles away, William's scouts reported the arrival. William did not sleep. He ordered his men to arm themselves in the darkness. Tomorrow, the world would change. Saturday, October 14th, 1066. The sun rose over a narrow ridge known as Senlac Hill. The name would later be corrupted to Sanguilac, the Lake of Blood. It would earn that name before sunset. Harold had chosen his ground perfectly. His army stood shoulder to shoulder along the ridgeline. They were packed so tightly that, according to chroniclers, a man who died could not fall to the ground. This was the shield wall, a single interlocking organism of wood and iron and flesh. In the front rank stood the housecarls, wielding the two-handed Dane axe. With a 4-foot handle and a razor-sharp iron head, this axe could cleave through a knight's helmet and skull in a single blow. The English strategy was simple. Stand firm. Let the Normans exhaust themselves trying to climb the hill. Do not break formation. Hold the line, and victory would come. At the bottom of the valley, William arranged his forces. He divided his army into 3 columns. He wore the papal banner on his lance. He wore the holy relics around his neck. He sat on his black war horse, staring up at the wall he had to break. The battle began with a moment of surreal madness. Before a single arrow flew, a Norman minstrel named Taillefer rode out from the lines. He was singing. He chanted the song of Roland. As he sang, he juggled his sword, tossing the glittering blade high into the air. The English watched in confused silence. Taillefer spurred his horse. He charged the English line alone. He killed 1 man. Then he was hacked to pieces. The first blood was spilled. The trance broke. The slaughter began. William opened with his archers. Thousands of arrows hissed into the sky, but shooting uphill meant the arrows lost momentum. Most simply bounced off the English shields. The shield wall did not budge. William signaled the infantry. The Norman foot soldiers trudged up the slope. As they neared the top, the English unleashed a storm of javelins and stones. The Normans crumpled. They could not penetrate the wall. Now William played his ace. He ordered the heavy cavalry to charge. This was the shock weapon of medieval Europe. Armored knights on massive war horses, carrying lances and swords. But horses are not machines. As the knights thundered up the hill, they hit a solid wall of shields that refused to break. The horses skidded to a halt, rearing up. That was when the axes came down. The English housecarls stepped forward, swinging their great weapons. The carnage was absolute. The axes smashed through chainmail. They hewed through horse necks. Riders were dragged from their saddles and butchered. For hours, the assault continued. Charge, fail, retreat. William watched with growing horror. His cavalry was useless. His infantry was being chewed apart. Then, disaster struck. On the left flank, the Breton division cracked. They panicked. They turned and ran down the hill. Seeing the enemy flee, the English discipline finally snapped. A section broke ranks. They shouted in triumph and chased the fleeing Bretons down into the valley. In the chaos, a rumor swept through the Norman army. The Duke is dead. William is dead. The panic became contagious. The entire Norman line began to waver. The invasion was seconds away from total collapse. William saw his dream dissolving. He had one chance to stop the rout. He did something no commander should ever do in the heat of battle. He tore the helmet from his head. In the middle of a storm of arrows and javelins, William exposed his bare face to the enemy. He rode back and forth along the line. "Look at me," he shouted. "I am alive, and by the grace of God, I will conquer." The effect was instantaneous. The fleeing men stopped. They saw the familiar, furious face of their duke. The panic evaporated. William did not just stop the rout, he weaponized it. The English soldiers, who had chased the Bretons, were now stranded in the open ground. Disorganized and celebrating prematurely, they were cut off from the shield wall. William led his cavalry in a sweeping charge. They rode down the exposed Englishmen and slaughtered them to the last man. As William watched the bodies pile up, a cold realization struck him. The shield wall was impenetrable as long as it stood still, but the English could not resist the temptation to chase a fleeing enemy. William decided to turn this accident into a strategy. He ordered his commanders to execute the feigned retreat. He ordered his cavalry to charge up the hill, clash briefly, and then turn and flee in apparent panic. The English, seeing the hated Normans run, roared with bloodlust. They broke ranks and chased the fleeing cavalry down the hill. The moment the English were stretched out on the slope, exposed and vulnerable, the Norman knights wheeled their horses around. The fleeing prey suddenly became predators. The slaughter was mechanical and devastating. William repeated this tactic again and again. Each time a chunk of the English army was lured away and destroyed. The solid wall of shields that had looked invincible in the morning now looked like a set of rotten teeth, full of gaps and holes. Harold's brothers were killed in the fighting. The best housecarls were dying one by one. The sun began to dip toward the horizon. The English were exhausted. They had been fighting for 9 hours. William sensed the end. He gathered his forces for one final crushing push. He ordered his archers to change their aim. Instead of shooting directly at the shield wall, they were to shoot high, to arc their arrows into the sky so they would fall vertically behind the English shields. The end came quickly. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, a falling arrow struck Harold in the face, piercing his right eye. He did not die instantly. He agonizingly pulled the shaft from his socket, blood blinding him. But modern historians believe this was only the beginning of the horror. A group of 4 Norman knights broke through the crumbling shield wall. They had one target, the king. They fell upon the blinded Harold like wolves. One knight drove a lance through Harold's chest. Another struck him across the neck. A third disemboweled him. The fourth hacked at his thigh, mutilating his body beyond recognition. This was not war. This was erasure. With the king dead, the English resistance evaporated. The surviving housecarls fought to the death around Harold's body, but the levies fled into the gathering darkness. Silence finally fell over Senlac Hill. The Lake of Blood had earned its name. William rode to the top of the ridge, to the spot where Harold's standard had fallen. He did not pray. He did not weep. He ordered his tent to be pitched right there, directly on top of the carnage, among the heaps of the dead. He sat down to eat his supper, surrounded by the corpses of his enemies. It was a message to God and men. I am the master of this slaughter. The next morning, the women came to claim their dead. The scene was apocalyptic. Harold's corpse was so badly mutilated that no one could identify him. His face was gone. In desperation, they sent for Edith Senlac, Harold's common-law wife of 20 years. She walked through the field of blood, looking for marks known only to her. Finally, she stopped. She found him, not by his face, but by marks on his body that only a lover would recognize. The last king of Anglo-Saxon England was wrapped in a purple cloak and carried away. The Battle of Hastings was over, but the conquest had only just begun. The surviving English nobility refused to submit. They gathered in London and elected a new king. They hoped to rally a resistance. William did not besiege London directly. Instead, he chose to strangle it. He marched his army in a wide circle around the city, burning everything in his path. He cut off the food supply. He terrified the population. One by one, the English lords rode out to submit. They surrendered not out of loyalty, but out of starvation and fear. On Christmas Day, 1066, William rode to Westminster Abbey to claim his prize. The bastard of Falaise was about to become the anointed King of England. Inside the abbey, the ceremony began. The surviving English nobility and the Norman victors stood in uneasy proximity. Outside, heavily armed Norman guards surrounded the church. The archbishop presented William to the congregation. He asked them in English if they accepted this man as their king. The English shouted their assent. Then the bishop asked the Normans the same question in French. They roared back their approval. The sound was deafening. But to the jittery Norman guards standing outside, it did not sound like cheering. It sounded like a riot. Panic exploded. Thinking the English were slaughtering the Duke, the guards turned on the crowd outside. They began hacking at bystanders. Then they set fire to the houses surrounding the abbey. Flames roared up the wooden walls. Smoke poured into the cathedral. The congregation panicked. Nobles trampled each other to escape. Only a handful of priests and William himself remained at the altar. The man who had charged alone against fleeing soldiers, who had maimed the citizens of Alençon, who had eaten dinner among the corpses at Hastings, was now trembling. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as shaking violently from head to foot. He stood alone in the empty, smoke-filled church, while the terrified archbishop hurriedly shoved the crown onto his head. William stumbled out of the abbey, not as a glorious monarch, but as a man escaping a burning building. That day set the tone for the rest of his reign. There would be no peace. William realized he could never be a loved king. He would have to be a jailer. Immediately after the coronation, he began to build. He did not build cathedrals or schools. He built fortresses, cages. In the southeast corner of London, he started construction on a massive stone tower. It was the White Tower, the heart of what would become the Tower of London. It was not built to protect London from outsiders. It was built to protect William from Londoners. Across England, similar castles rose, hundreds of them, stone fingers pointing at the sky, reminding the English that they were now a conquered people. But the English did not submit quietly. For years, rebellions flickered across the kingdom. In 1069, the biggest explosion came. The north rose up. Rebels in York slaughtered the Norman garrison. William's patience finally snapped. He marched north, but this time, he did not come to fight a battle. He came to execute a region. He initiated a policy that history remembers as the harrying of the North. It was systematic annihilation. William divided his army into small squads. Their orders were simple: destroy everything that sustains life. They burned the crops in the fields. They smashed the farming tools. They slaughtered every animal they found. They salted the earth so nothing would grow. The result was a famine of biblical proportions. Contemporary chroniclers describe roads littered with corpses that no one was left to bury. Survivors ate dogs. They ate horses. Some sources whisper of cannibalism. Modern historians estimate that over 100,000 people died. When the Doomsday Book was compiled almost 20 years later, the entry for much of the North simply read, "Waste." The spirit of the English was broken. In 1085, William ordered the Great Survey. He sent commissioners to every corner of England to record who owned every piece of land and how much tax could be squeezed from it. The result was the Doomsday Book. To the English, it felt like the Book of Judgment Day, a final, inescapable record of their dispossession. 95% of the land in England was now owned by French-speaking Normans. The Old English aristocracy had been completely erased. And so we return to where we began. The year is 1087. The man who burned the north and audited a kingdom lies dying in a monastery near Rouen. William was 60 years old. His final injury came during a siege, when his horse stumbled and threw him against the iron pommel of his saddle, rupturing his intestines. For 6 weeks he lay in agony. On his deathbed, the iron facade finally cracked. Chroniclers describe William being seized by fear of the afterlife. He confessed his sins, trembling as he recounted the rivers of blood he had spilled. "I treated the native inhabitants with unreasonable severity," he reportedly said. "I cruelly oppressed them. I caused the death of thousands by starvation and war. I am stained with the rivers of blood I have shed." He tried to buy his way into heaven, distributing treasure to churches. But mercy came too late for a man who had shown so little of it. On the morning of September 9th, 1087, William the Conqueror drew his last breath. And then the final indignity began. The moment he died, his servants stripped his body of anything valuable. They left the king's corpse naked on the floor and fled. The body lay abandoned for hours. Finally, a local knight paid for the transport to Caen, where William had built a great abbey. But the funeral became a grotesque comedy of errors. First, a fire broke out in the town. Then, as the body lay in state, a man burst into the church claiming that William had stolen the land the abbey was built on. He demanded compensation before the burial could proceed. The embarrassed bishops had to pay him off in front of the mourners. But the worst was yet to come. William's body had been swelling in the summer heat. By the time the monks tried to lower it into the stone coffin, it was bloated beyond recognition. The coffin was too small. The monks panicked. They pushed. They shoved. They tried to force the swollen corpse into the narrow space. And then, with a sickening sound, William's abdomen burst open. A stench so foul, so toxic, filled the cathedral that knights vomited into their hands, and priests fainted mid-prayer. The congregation fled. The ceremony was abandoned. The man who had terrified Europe ended his life as a rotting, exploding mess. It was a fitting end for a man whose life had been defined by violence. He had clawed his way from bastard to king. He had conquered a nation and erased its ruling class. He had changed the course of history with sword and fire. But in the end, even conquerors rot. So why does this story matter? Because William did not just conquer England, he transformed it. He created a new ruling class that would shape the country for centuries. He built castles that still stand. He fused French and English into the hybrid language you are hearing right now. We raise cows but eat beef. We tend sheep but serve mutton. The very vocabulary of power in English comes from the conqueror's tongue. William was not a hero, he was a catastrophe. But catastrophes can be creative. They can destroy one world and build another on the ruins. The boy who woke up screaming in his guardian's blood became the man who ate dinner among the dead. The bastard who was hunted through the forests of Normandy became the king who broke the back of a nation. He proved the dark lesson of his childhood. Legitimacy is not given, it is taken, and history belongs to those who have the stomach to write it in blood. Childhood trauma can forge two paths, one toward empathy, one toward cruelty. Have you seen leaders shaped by the wounds they suffered young? Leave a comment if you know their names. And if you want more stories about the making of monsters and kings, subscribe, one every week. Today, the abbey at Caen still stands. William's tomb is there, though it has been desecrated and rebuilt many times over the centuries. The bones inside may or may not be his. It does not matter. The man is gone. Only the consequences remain. And every October, tourists walk the fields of Hastings, trying to imagine the screams and the blood. They stand where Harold fell. They look up the hill where the shield wall stood. The grass is green now. The birds sing. The lake of blood has long since drained away. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of a voice, carried on the wind across 1,000 years. Look at me, I am alive, and by the grace of God, I will conquer.